So in our last episode, we were working on the walls, and the walls, getting done with that is a great feeling. The walls took a lot of work, a lot of sort of strength and energy to get them done, a lot of logs to work with, and a real learning process. But in reality, it's probably the easiest part of the structure. Now comes this tricky part. We're going to start working on the roof structure. Now, the roof structure really isn't that much more complicated, because what we're going to be doing here is basically an extension of how the walls worked. We're not going to be doing rafters per se, but log purlins, which really, it's very, very similar to how the walls went up, except we're going to have to play around with the angles and how we cut the notches. It gets a lot more precise. Some of the cabins that we see in the 18th and 19th century were made in this fashion where it's an extension of the walls, except they taper very rapidly as we go up. This notch kind of looks exactly like what we've been doing. The problem here is that we have to sink this notch down into this purlin log a little bit, or else the log that goes over the top of it, since the roof surface is right here, there would be very, very little of this upper log to hold that in place and to hold this purlin log in place, to kind of lock it in. So we have to shrink there, or sink this notch down a little bit into this log to leave more structural material of this log that sets down, so that it has enough strength to hold this purlin into position. So we have to make this notch even more complicated than it originally looks like. Well, I'm real happy with our first couple of gable end logs. We've got those up into position. They're looking good. I put in a actual little impromptu plumb bob here on our peak log, so that as we put our strings down, we can get a really good gauge about where these purlin logs are going in. And we've got our first purlin set in position, and it's heavy. I was concerned about the logs bending a little bit as they dried, so I used oak up here. Way too heavy. This thing is so heavy we have to use tripods to put it up into position. Is this the fall? So it's time to work on this door. We're not as far along as I really wanted to be before we started to cut the door opening out, but jumping up and down to get inside of the cabin is getting very tiring. So we're going to go ahead and start prepping, at least to cut an opening so that we can start to get in and out make it a little bit easier. We still have to climb up to work on that roof, but getting inside is getting to be a real pain. The weather is starting to change here. It's starting to get cold, and thank goodness we just put up the last purlin, this peak purlin. So satisfying. And as the walls were great to get finished, but as soon as we started bringing that roof in, made all the difference. It's really starting to come together. It totally looks like a cabin. I'm so excited by how it's starting to look. And now we got to get some cover on these purlins. We'll start putting the roofing material on. Then it's going to feel like a cabin. I'm really excited too about the way these gable ends came together. Everything is extremely stable up here, so I'm really happy with the way these gable ends turned out. It's almost time to start working on putting the roofing material on. We're just doing a little bit of last prep work on the purlins to kind of flatten them out a little bit. In Nolan's memoirs about growing up in the Midwest in the early 19th century, he talks about living in a bark-covered house. And here is a piece of tulip bark, and this bark is off of some of these trees. Some of these trees were cut down and more than a year and a half ago, and I took the bark off. And if you cut these trees down in the spring, you can remove the bark all in one big giant sheet. And so we've got a bunch of this bark that we harvested almost 18 months ago. Nolan complained, he talked about his mother complaining about this bark. Instead of nailing it down, which maybe they didn't have nails, but they just weighted it down with weight logs. So they would take logs and put it on top of the roof in a kind of a ladder structure to help hold all the roofing material down. We might do a little bit of that. We also have a couple of other things to try out. These are black locust thorns. And you would think a thorn off of a tree, and some of these thorns can get 3 or 4 inches long. These thorns are extremely hard and extremely sharp. And if we're going into a green tulip log, you can pound these in just like a nail. And we also have some nails. We don't want to use a lot of these nails. Nails back then were very expensive, so we'll be very judicious with our nail use. Probably put some weight logs on too to help hold this bark down. This is going to be quite an experiment.
Yeah, I bet you have. I think.
The roof is on. It's amazing. The roofing material we use for this, the tulip bark, I harvested that over probably a 2-month period, more than a year ago. Took a tremendous quantity of time. Yesterday, we had all the purlins done and we said, let's start putting the bark on. The purlins probably took us, 3 days to get ready. The bark, it went up like that. All that work that we'd done previously just went right together, and the roof is on it. It just needs some tiny little bit of touch-up work. So we've gotten over the 2 of the biggest hurdles. Got the walls up, and those were heavy and big and took a lot of time. And we got this whole roof structure, which is a little more complex. And boy, that's really made a ton of difference to this. We could start living it if we had to right now. So I'm excited about what we've done and how much work it's been. But what's coming up next is the chimney. And that's going to have some real challenges in it and some engineering. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to go together, but I'm just so excited to get started on that. And I want to thank you guys for coming along on this journey. We're trying to live history. We're trying to understand it by doing it. And we've learned so much that I'm just so excited to move forward with this. Thanks for coming along on this journey with us. Thanks for watching today.